Welcome to Voices from the Field, a podcast series produced by the National Collaborating Centre for Indigenous Health, which focuses on innovative research and community-based initiatives promoting the health and well-being of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. In this episode, we hear from Amber MacLean-Hawes about the emergency management planning that has been done by the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. Over the past 5 years, this adaptation project comprehensively supports the 8 First Nation member communities with emergency preparedness using a holistic approach through a climate and health lens.
My name is Amber MacLean-Hawes. I'm currently the Emergency Management Program Manager with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. I'm also talking to you today from the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people here in Nova Scotia. I've been with CMM for almost 5 years and working on the emergency preparedness initiatives and programming with 8 First Nation member communities that we serve and support. We work with Acadia First Nation. We also have Annapolis Valley First Nation, Bear River First Nation, Glooscap First Nation, Millbrook First Nation, Sabaganagati First Nation, and then we have Buckingag Mi'kmaq Nation and Pictou Landing First Nation.
Can you tell me about the work you've been doing on emergency management with First Nations communities in your region and how it relates to climate change?
Over the past 5 years, we really started doing work and was really getting a sense of seeing where communities are at related to emergency preparedness. But with a heavy focus on climate change and how that impacts emergencies and also the health impacts of both of those on our communities. So when our communities are going through an emergency event, we're seeing if climate change has an impact, and also what are the health impacts from these emergency events that are happening to your community members, and how are these things kind of stacking on top of each other. So currently right now, we're working with multiple communities on developing their response plans. We've done risk analysis with the majority of our communities that then feed into our response plans. We've done multiple levels of training, everything from different types of emergency management training or incident command systems training. And we've also done stuff that are kind of outside of the main emergency management, but stem on some of those issues of climate change that our communities are concerned about. For our communities, that's where the big drive and focus is for emergency management, is really behind the change in our climates, because we're aware when we've looked at some of the things that our communities have noticed for trends in our area. We are seeing stronger storms. We're seeing the frequency of events such as hurricanes happening more often. We're seeing changing in our rain and snow patterns within our winters in Nova Scotia and what our winters are looking like. We're also seeing there's more drought happening in our area, which we're preparing for more wildfires as a result of that. Community members have also mentioned a change in animal migration patterns coming into, so we know that that's also an aspect of climate. But that's something that also leads into emergency planning, say if an example mentioning the increase of ticks in Nova Scotia, which in turn, someone might not see that as an emergency management response. But if we see this increase in ticks and then we see an increase in Lyme disease, that is turning into then like a health emergency, right? And how our province deals with that, and especially our communities and awareness around that. So I think we are on that track to start looking a little bit more broadly of what considers an emergency event and how we frame it, and also who's all involved in that. So it might be emergency managers, and it's probably health that's probably going to step in quite a bit there. But really working together, because I think there's key aspects in both sectors that really help with something like that. And then we're also seeing with our climate, since our climate's changing, we're also seeing decrease in animal habitat, which has also impacted our communities with some of their traditional harvesting and different events like that, and where they're going for some traditional foods and how they're getting that supply is shifting as well. And community members have noticed that the animals that we'd usually hunt, they might not be okay to hunt anymore, and especially okay to eat, based on our climate and based on different aspects that have been happening within our area and the environmental issues that we're all facing. So those are some of those climate change things that we're still aware of, and they're always in the background and happening. So probably within the second year of the project and doing a bunch of surveying, community workshops and engagements, Wildfires, not that they occur often in our region, but it was a large concern due to the potential impact that they could have on our communities and where they're situated. So we've also done a lot of wildfire assessments, different levels of training, so wildfire suppression, just providing skills into our community members so that they can increase their capacity to respond if something were to happen. We've also been focusing on a large wildfire prevention project, which is really looking at ways our communities can prevent the risk of wildfire. So everything there from like training and engagement to focusing on the individual homes and what they can do around their home, expanding it to the broader community and what the community can do collectively. And then looking at some of the larger mitigation actions that we can take as we're working this spring to do a fire break surrounding Bear River First Nation. We piloted that project with them based on their high risk for wildfires and also where the community is situated. It's heavily forested and it's also up on a hill. And based on current wildfire occurrences in Nova Scotia, they were kind of at that high priority. And kind of a good pilot community to start working with to focus on some of those levels of preparedness within emergency management related to wildfire. And then also looking at climate, how our climate's shifting. We are seeing warmer temperatures, and especially that southern region of the province. We're seeing more climate data that is saying that it's getting warmer, and especially within wildfire season, we're seeing that as well. So that's kind of why we focus there. But the thing to really mention is a lot of this is community focused and community driven. We are trying to find more ways because this project started out very heavily focused on climate change and health adaptation and finding ways to adapt to our current climate. And then we shifted a little bit more into emergency preparedness, but also really adding that health impact, like health aspect to that. Because typically the emergency management world, and it is changing, which is wonderful. But when I started, it was really focused on natural disasters and natural events. Very standardized to those things. It was more of a challenge trying to bring in those health aspects into emergency management and what that looks like, the psychosocial aspects and elements of an emergency event and how our community members are impacted by those. And not just short term, also like the long-term impacts of those events. We've done surveying within the first year of the project to see like a lot of the things community members have experienced in emergencies that are concerning for them is when they're either doing an emergency event, they feel like they're being isolated or they're being displaced from their home and from their community. At times, we're also seeing damages to structures, and then a lot of rebuilding has to take place to the physical community, but I think sometimes we forget about the rebuilding that has to take place to the individual and the community members when someone goes through an event such as that. So we're always being mindful of that and finding ways like how do we incorporate recovery into our emergency management planning.
Can you tell me some of the health implications that you've been observing?
When we look at health, we kind of broke it down based on the medicine wheel and looking at the physical aspects, the mental aspects, emotional and spiritual, to see what communities, what their take on is, like what their take on those aspects and how they've been impacted. So given a range of emergency events that have happened, power outages, winter storms, hurricanes, flooding, water boil advisories that happen. A lot of the physical stuff was more around like body pain, different levels of injury, and sometimes infectious diseases because of the situations. But then we start really expanding more into like the mental health aspect and looking at like how we've had stress and anxiety play a role in emergency events. Communities did mention a concern around addictions when an emergency event happens. So we know that there are folks struggling with addictions and trying to be mindful of that while we're planning for emergencies, because we know that could also be a challenge and also add an extra level of concern on someone when they're already currently dealing with something and then have to deal with an emergency event on top of that. And then we have things as like post-traumatic stress injury or depression. And some people are even mentioning stuff with like their sleep habits and stuff have changed after an emergency event. A lot of folks were feeling like anger, sadness, panic. A lot of times there was like periods of grief felt, and then there was a lot of like pain and suffering felt on that emotional side, and then also loneliness. And that's usually happening when we see people, say an example, we have a power outage and so they no longer have access possibly to social media, access to their families. Maybe they have to relocate to somewhere where there is power. So that could create a sense of loneliness in the event of emergency. Spiritual plays a role as well as how the community comes together during an emergency event, what someone is doing to cope on their spiritual level during an event. But looking at family coming together, some people mention loss, having a loss of connection during those events and loss of hope, and some other things like that. Multiple things of social determinants of health that our communities might face differently than other communities. Also looking at where our communities are situated. They probably aren't in the best geographical area. So that also creates an extra level of stress on a community too when we're having an emergency event within their infrastructure, and also how we're recovering from that when systems are already at capacity. And then we know that there's still a lot of work within like housing. So looking at more some of those health promotion aspects and how they'll actually go hand in hand with the emergency preparedness and management. And I think if we start incorporating some of those ahead of time and within our planning, like we're planning and doing preparedness so that we don't have to, really hoping that we never get to the event, that the event doesn't happen. And if it does, then we're prepared for it. But we really want to be proactive and not reactive within our planning as well, which is also looking at, we need to focus a little bit more on the upstream approaches, even with an emergency management compared to looking at downstream. If we do have a storm and say we're having a large power outage, in Nova Scotia, it happens quite easily based on our infrastructure. But what are ways that we can at least support our communities in that, or maybe even with communication, so that we're not seeing as long a period with them losing communication or power or access to? So really looking proactively into some of those things.
Can you tell me why it is important to have an emergency plan in place for First Nations communities?
The importance of it is so that communities kind of understand where their resources can be focused in the event of an emergency. Plans are extremely important, but something that's a next step up from that is actually understanding and exercising our plans. We have an emergency management plan that's been created, and then what happens is if it gets put on a shelf and we're not exercising it, then we're kind of losing a bit of that level of preparedness that we put time into. So where a plan is extremely important, it's also important to exercise that, keep them updated regularly, and continue to bring in the folks that need to be in that plan. But plan development takes a long time because it takes consistency. We've been working at this for the last 5 years, really trying to develop these plans. Risk assessments, we've done those quite extensively with our communities as well, because they all go into our emergency management plan. But the risk assessments, they can take a lot of time to accomplish. But communities are quite aware of their risk generally, and based on historically, like what has happened. So communities kind of know, like, yes, every March, once the snow thaws, we're going to get flooding in this area because it's happened over and over and over. Or communities are like, yes, we know that there's a rail line that goes through our community, so we know that that could be a potential risk. So there's certain things like that that communities are always aware of, but it's just how we're laying it out within their emergency management plan, creating just maybe a little bit more ease when that event actually happens, that if you have a plan, you might be able to easily flip through it, find what you need, and work with the team. Last year, the year before that, it was Hurricane Dorian came into our communities, and communities prepared knowing that it was coming within, we had a couple weeks notice that that event was happening. So you see communities starting to get ready, getting their supplies and resources ready for their members, but also seeing how communities would, if another neighboring community, say they required a generator because their power outage was going to be longer than another community, we're seeing communities donate those to other communities to support them. Those are really big strengths that we're seeing, that support and that neighboring support from our First Nations communities to each other, but also seeing that within just other communities that surround our First Nations communities and other municipalities, seeing them support them in ways was really positive. And then also just seeing community members just step up and help their neighbor, like help someone if they need to get their driveway shoveled because someone needs to get out, or feel okay to go clear some trees in an area, or check in on maybe an elder to make sure that they have what they need during this power outage. A lot of times we focus on what could we have done better? Maybe what were some of the negatives, and maybe what were some ways we were prepared. But I think sometimes we lose focus on acknowledging like what we did really well, and how us doing those things really well really gave us more time to focus on some of those areas where we needed more work within our planning. So I think sometimes just to be reminded and mindful that we need to look at, yes, there are weaknesses, but we also really need to highlight our strengths that we do in emergency related events.
Well, on that very strengths-based conclusion, I really want to thank you, Amber, because the work that you're doing and the work that is being done by the communities that you're working with surely will support them as we see more and more climate changes happening within the regions. And it's really important, as you say, to have those emergency management plans and processes in place so that communities are safe during these events that will be coming in future years. So I really want to thank you for taking your time to talk with us today, Amber, and it's been a real pleasure to hear of the work that's underway.
Thanks, Roberta. Thanks for having me and welcoming me on to this. It's been kind of exciting, and it's been kind of our first time we've kind of done something like this. So we really appreciate it, and always want to just remind folks that it's really our communities are driving this, and we're just helping to help coordinate some of the efforts.
To hear more podcasts in this series, head to Voices from the Field on the National Collaborating Centre for Indigenous Health's website, nccih.ca. Music on this podcast is by Blue Dot Sessions. It appears under a Creative Commons license. To learn more, go to www.sessions.blue.